Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Chinese President Xi Jinping meets DPRK leader Kim Jong Un for the second time in weeks at the Chinese port city of Dalian. Could China be the diplomatic analyst to the anticipated DPRK-US summit? And the US and the Philippines hold their yearly joint military drills, touted to be the largest under Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. What do the exercises mean for regional security? Will China be the catalyst? We begin our show in Dalian, Liaoning province in China, where Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It is the second meeting between the two in 5 weeks. What does this mean for the diplomatic momentum of denuclearization efforts on the Korean Peninsula? Before our discussion, take a look at this first.
Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China and the President of China, has met with Kim Jong Un, Chairman of the Workers' Party of Korea and Chairman of the State Affairs Commission of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The meeting took place in Dalian, northeast China's Liaoning province, from May 7th to the 8th. General Secretary Xi spoke highly of Kim revisiting China after just 40 days. He said Kim's trip to China showed the great attachment between the two parties and the two countries. It also showed the importance of their strategic communication, especially at a critical moment in the Korean Peninsula situation. Since Xi's first meeting with Kim, bilateral ties and the Korean Peninsula tensions had made positive progress. Xi Jinping expressed his delight in witnessing this. He said he's looking forward to the next meeting with Kim to further promote a healthy and stable development of China-DPRK relations and long-term peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. Kim said he came to China again at a crucial time in the regional situation to meet with General Secretary Xi Jinping. His trip aims to inform Xi Jinping of the latest in the quickly developing situation. The DPRK leader hopes to strengthen strategic communication and cooperation with China, deepen the bilateral friendship, and promote regional peace and stability. Kim said the previous leaders of the two countries built a strong foundation of trust and bonds between the two sides. The first meeting between Xi Jinping and Kim took place in Beijing in March. To achieve more comprehensive development of ties, cooperation between the two sides has to catch up with the demands of the new era. Xi Jinping addressed the current developments of the Korean Peninsula situation, saying the Chinese and DPRK's leaders' talks in March helped them reach consensus on related issues. China has been active and made substantial progress in bringing all parties to the table. Xi Jinping says the outcome of the inter-Korean dialogues continue to promote regional stability. He said he's willing to work together with Kim to continue to guide relevant departments of both sides, implement the consensuses they have reached, and promote the continuous advancement of China-DPRK relations.
For more on the second meeting in weeks between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the DPRK leader Kim Jong Un, we have in our Beijing studio Zhao Tong, who is a fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua University, and he is with the nuclear program over there. And joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Richard White, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Also joining us on the phone, we have Mr. Yuan Peng, who is the vice president of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. I want to welcome to the three of you. This is a big news, actually. Mr. Yuan, if I could have you on the phone for us, how should we understand the two important words used by the two leaders from China and also from the DPRK? When it comes to denuclearization, this is a process of phased, synchronous. Those are the two words being used, phased, synchronous. Your understanding here, sir?
Yes, I think this is something new used by the two leaders, DPRK and the Chinese. And most importantly, they met twice in 30 days is unprecedented, and it's a very sensitive timing because it's right before the coming Kim and Trump meeting. So the world is looking for how will the denuclearization move ahead. So in this very sensitive moment, and President Xi and Kim meeting and talking about reaffirm to move the direction of denuclearization and proposed very concrete steps. That's the two words you just mentioned, phased and
synchronous.
And what synchronous. As this shows that both sides very constructively propose some creative thinking,
yes,
and to show its sincerity to move towards denuclearization in the future.
Right. What about for Mr. White, coming from Washington's perspective, face the synchronous? Will those two words be welcomed by Washington? Of course, we understand Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump, according to the tweet put forward by President Trump, were in a telephone conversation with one another. We don't know yet the result of that telephone conversation, but from Washington's perspective, two words, phased, synchronous. What do you think about it?
You know, it's a bit tricky to know how the U.S. will react, because the U.S. has always insisted on the key words of complete, verifiable, irreversible elimination of North Korea's nuclear weapons. There's no specific reference to synchronized or phased. I mean, that implies sort of a step-for-step, action-for-action response. That was tried earlier with the six-party talks over a decade ago, and it did result in a nuclear agreement, so that might be acceptable. Certainly, the Trump administration seems open to deal-making. The president's going to meet with Kim. He has a good relation with President Xi, at least on this issue. So, you know, maybe that's something that they will incorporate into their approach, as long as it leads to the elimination of North Korea's nuclear arsenal at the end of the process.
I see. Well, let me ask you, Mr. Zhao, also in the Beijing studio, about that step by step. That, according to Mr. White, may not be necessarily the way that the U.S. wants. But if you look at the CVID, that's what they say, right? That is complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. Are they in conflict with one another, these two sets of phrases? One is phased, synchronous. The other is the CVID, as I just mentioned.
Well, in fact, the new U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, a few days ago used a new, slightly different term. He said permanent and verifiable, irreversible denuclearization is PID. But I think in either case, either CVID or PID, the general idea is this is the goal of the United States. This is the eventual objective to completely and comprehensively disarm North Korea. The Chinese or North Korean term of phased and synchronized approach describes the means to achieve that goal. I think both parties, both China, U.S., share this goal. Even North Korea. North Korean leader recently explicitly committed to this eventual goal of denuclearization, and that was put into the Panmunjom Declaration during the Inter-Korean Summit meeting. So I think no one challenges the eventual goal. The real question really is how to move from here to there. I think in the China-North Korean second summit meeting, both leaders said it requires a process to resolve their political differences and to build trust. Trust building, by definition, is time-consuming. You cannot hope to immediately get trust on the first day of a bilateral meeting. It requires a process that usually starts with some easy steps. North Korea has already taken measures to freeze its nuclear missile tests and commits to dismantling of the nuclear test site. I think China and North Korea agree we can use these initial steps to start a long-term process that can build trust and eventually leads to the goal of denuclearization.
Mr. White, what about that? Mr. Zhao just made his point. That is, one is the eventual goal, the CVID or the PID, as we just mentioned. The other is the means to get there. Without trust, without the means to get there, how can we achieve it? Mr. White.
I mean, in principle, they are harmonious. I think a U.S. concern would be we might have the U.S. and other countries make concessions, relax sanctions, and then North Korea doesn't follow through with denuclearization. That is the Washington interpretation of what happened in the past. So, but in principle, they're harmonious. I mean, it really depends on what really concrete actions. I know we talked about trust, but I'm not sure how important that is. It's clearly in the China and Chinese and Korean discourse on this, but from the U.S. perspective, I don't think we will ever trust North Korea, but the U.S. has reached arms control agreements with many countries it doesn't trust. That's primarily why it does that, because it relies on verification and other means. So I think we can skirt that along. I mean, as long the Chinese are welcome to promote that. I don't think Washington necessarily needs to buy into that language, but I'm not sure that that can't be overcome. I think it's just a different perspective on the Chinese and U.S. Negotiating views in general about the importance of trust and values as opposed to concrete measures of verification and so on.
Mr. Weiss did mention, Mr. Yuan, if I could have you on the phone, that during the six-party talks there was similar method being used, and yet it didn't work out. Of course, Mr. Yuan, right now it is different because the DPRK has already acquired quite some capabilities compared to earlier rounds of six-party talks. So will these two words be important? From China's perspective, will that be the foundation to move ahead? If that were, will there be a sea difference in attitude between the United States and China on this? What would that mean?
Yeah, I think it's a very historical moment that the first time the three major parties, I mean U.S., China, and the DPRK, and also South Korea, the four parties share the same goal, that is pursuing for the final denuclearization. But the problem is that, number one, how to define the so-called denuclearization. I think different parties, in particular the United States and the DPRK, has a subtle differences. For example, American use the new term PVID or CVID, and for North Korea still a little bit ambiguous. And secondly, how to achieve that goal, through which means. I think many Americans think that maybe they want to use the summit, the coming summit, to resolve this in a very short term. But given the situation lasted so long in the past several years, so for North Korea and the DPRK side, they prefer using the mutual assured steps through the phased and synchronized ways. And for China, we also initiated the so-called freeze for freeze. We think the freeze for freeze is the very first step, very realistic step to move ahead. So my conclusion is that, first of all, we share very common interest, common goals. This is a very good historical opportunity both sides or relevant parties should seize. While at the same time, we also face some difficulties and risks. So if the United States and DPRK coming summit cannot overcome the differences to seize the new opportunities, still I think there are some potential risks. So that's why I think this meeting, I mean Xi and Kim's meeting in 40 days, twice, I think to show Chinese do hope to play some constructive role to push DPRK and the United States to moving in the right direction.
Right. After our first round discussion with the three of you, there are several questions that comes to my mind. One is, what does this relationship mean, Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing? the relationship between China and DPRK, now after DPRK acquires already quite some nuclear capabilities, and particularly over the past 2 months when things are really moving fast, how has the nature of this relationship been evolving? What could that mean for the next steps of any plan for denuclearization on Korean Peninsula? Mr. Zhao.
Well, actually, I'm going to make a controversial point, which is, I think,
Thank you for warning me.
I think for the last few years, North Korea has been in the driver's seat for China-North Korea bilateral relationship. China never has real disagreements with North Korea in all issue areas except nuclear.
Okay.
Even on nuclear issue, China is a little sympathetic about why North Korea feels it needs nuclear weapons for its security. So China has always wanted to maintain a normal and stable relationship with North Korea. It was basically because North Korea decided to accelerate its nuclear missile development and therefore forced China to join international coalition to impose unprecedented economic sanctions on North Korea. And therefore we see China-North Korea relationship dropped to historical lows. But after North Korea obtained a basic deterrent successfully by the end of 2017, North Korea now is a different stage. Now it wants to pivot to economic development, wants to develop a normal relationship with everyone else. So China, therefore, that created an opportunity for China and North Korea relationship to quickly improve. But looking forward, I think China would have an important role to contribute. Having a nuclear deterrent, having a basic sense of security, North Korea is now more capable of introducing radical measures, economic development and reform. Yes. North Korean leader reportedly, when he was in Beijing last time, he said he wanted to learn from the successful experience of governance of CCP, Chinese Communist Party. I think North Korean leader wants to learn the successful experience of China's economic development reform, and China will be in a special and very useful, important position to provide assistance, advice, guidance, etc.
Right. Mr. Yuan, I want to come back to you on China-North Korea issue. China-DPRK, its history of interaction dating back 6 decades. There seems to be different takeaways even if you ask Chinese on the street. Though, Mr. Yuan, what do you think about the change of relationship since North Korea, DPRK trying to develop the nuclear program, and over the past 2 months when things are developing fast, and now you see intensive interactions within a very short period of time between DPRK and Chinese top leaders. How should we understand the nature now of this relationship? What are the two countries looking for in each other?
Yes, the China-DPRK relations is very unique, and in the past several years, China is working very hard to our best to have balanced how to develop our traditional friendship relations, while at the same time to pursue the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. But it's very hard to have this kind of balanced. Given the difficulties, then we see some problem in the past several years between the two countries. But now I think in 40 days, the two summits and also State Councilor for Mr. Wang Yi's visit and Song Tao, the Minister of International Department of CVC's visit, to show how warm of today's bilateral relations. So both sides appreciate the warm up of the relations. So during the meeting, I think President Xi stressed 4 points to show our willingness to develop the relations. Number one, and appreciate the traditional friendship of the relations, and also he mentioned we both are socialist countries, which has a strategic importance of the relations, and also emphasizes the party exchanges, which is very important for the bilateral. Also mentioned the people to people as the base of the relations. So those 4 points to show the guideline of the future of Chinese developing our relations of DPRK. So we hope that the summits and the intensity of the meetings to open up and improve our relations in more bright future, I think. Yes.
It is important what we have seen over the past few weeks. But on the other hand, Mr. White, if I could go to you in Washington, D.C., tell me what about the preparations for the summit between DPRK leader Kim Jong Un and the U.S. President Donald Trump? Even about the location, now it is still a mystery. Not to mention what is likely to be the framework in which they're going to talk to one another and the attitudes they're going to bring to the summit. Don't forget that just 2 days ago, the DPRK leader Kim Jong Un was saying that the U.S. is not creating a good mood when it's trying to push on certain issues and blames to the DPRK. Mr. White, preparation.
I think you correctly raised something that is unknown. We don't quite know. I mean, President Trump has said they've decided where and when in principle, but he hasn't told us, and unlike many things, this has not leaked to the media, so we don't know where, when, what they'll talk about. And then, as you mentioned, the mood and atmospherics could change very quickly as they have in the past. I mean, I was in Seoul at the time of the Inter-Korea Summit, and it was a very good time, and everything seemed to work out well. But the Kim, I mean, especially depending on what President Trump decides to do with the Iran deal later today, it could really have a major impact on the perspectives of the two countries when they meet. In this regard, I would think the Chinese role is helpful. But as our guest in Beijing mentioned, at some point we'll need to transition the U.S.-North Korea dialogue to a broader framework, bringing in South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, at least the original 6 party states, and that presents its own complexities.
Right. Mr. Zhao, what about that, the preparation? Do we know anything new at all? Or is China and DPRK now trying to set a tone about what could be to be decided framework?
Yeah, on the second part of your question, I think the tone is already set.
Which
now,
is?
China, North Korea, South Korea, and Russia all agree about the principle of achieving denuclearization, which is, they use different terms, phased, synchronized, or step-by-step, incremental, but they all mean it must be a long-term process.
But what about peace? What about security guarantee? That we haven't mentioned.
That's why we have to make it long-term and incremental, because security guarantee cannot be irreversible. It's difficult for North Korea to trust the U.S. security guarantee on day one. But on your second question, I heard about 2 most possible candidates in terms of location.
Okay.
One is Panmunjom, but on the North Korean side. The second is Singapore. In fact, after the news of the second China-North Korean summit meeting just broke out, many international reporters talk about Singapore as a more likely candidate, because maybe, this is the first time that Kim Jong Un took the North Korean equivalent of Air Force One to travel to another country.
Right. But by the way, we are not here to announce any news related to the location, so people do not misunderstand what we're talking about. We're just reporting to everybody what we have learned through the media about this.
People speculated, maybe this is a test run of Kim Jong Un, taking an airplane to a third country for summit meeting. So maybe Singapore sounds like a likelihood. But I think, personally, I think Panmunjom, especially on the North Korean side, is a more likely option, because North Korea would love to play the role of a host.
Right.
And also South Korea would benefit, because in case North Korea-U.S. summit meeting doesn't go well, South Korea can intervene very easily and help mediate. And also, all these 3 countries want to have a trilateral meeting right after the bilateral summit concludes. So by let the meeting take place at Panmunjom could naturally have this trilateral meeting to follow immediately the bilateral summit between U.S. and North Korea.
We'll see what they choose, in fact, at the end of the day. But Mr. Yuan, here's the thing. Quite complicated, I would say. When we are talking about this, the DPRK and the U.S. summit that could take place, we are also looking at, just a few hours from now, according to U.S. President Donald Trump's personal tweet, he's likely to announce decisions related to the Iran nuclear deal. So we are looking at an overall very different pictures going on at the same time. Mr. Yuan, how shall we see the different signals pushed forward by the United States, particularly leading up to the midterm election, if you look at the internal politics in Washington, Mr. Yuan?
I think diplomacy is an expansion of domestic politics, in particular for today's American President Donald Trump, because domestically he faced some difficulties, the Russian Gate scandal and other kind of problems. So midterm election matters very much for himself, also for his party. And today, given the domestic, splitted and polarized politics, so how to gain its foreign policy achievements is very important for him.
Right.
So that's why he invested more energies today, recently, on DPRK nuclear issues, on Iranian nuclear issues, even on the U.S.-China, economic disputes and the trade disputes. So I think that's mainly, for me to see, is mainly driven by domestic politics.
Right. Before you go, Mr. Yuan, I want to follow up, but just very briefly, we understand the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is likely to be in the United States next week, also on further interaction when it comes to the trade issue between China and the U.S. Mr. Yuan, shall we expect anything?
Of course. I think both sides want to avoid the trade war, and it's not good for the bilateral relations. Also, it's not good for the whole world. So we cannot overcome the difficulties through just one meeting or two meetings. So now it's the second round after American teams, economic teams visiting China, and Liu He and his team will go to visit America next week. So I hope, given this several rounds of dialogues and negotiations, I hope our bilateral trade disputes can be soft landing.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Yuan Peng, for taking your time and to be with us on the phone. Before we go, I do want to invite the final sentence coming from the other two panelists with us. Mr. Zhao, shall we expect anything dramatic in the very near future, DPRK issue?
I don't think so, especially for U.S. domestic politics reasons. Trump wouldn't let the summit meeting appear a failure, especially after he took all the trouble to fly to Asia to meet with Kim Jong Un. So whatever the results, I think he will spin it to look like a great success.
All right, Mr. White, final words.
It's really hard to say that nothing dramatic will happen, given how volatile the relationship has been between those two countries. So I would be a little less optimistic that we're smooth sailing ahead.
All right, Richard Weiss, you want to stay with us for the next round of discussion, and Zhao Tong, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Shoulder-to-shoulder military exercises between the U.S. and the Philippines are underway. This year's are announced to be the biggest under Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. We'll ask our panelists what the drills mean for regional security right after this break. You're watching World Insight. Now let's turn to US-Philippine military drills, dubbed as Balikatan, or shoulder-to-shoulder in Filipino. The exercise began on Monday and were expected to run until May the 18th. This year marks the 34th Balikatan exercise. So what is the aim of the US-Philippines drills, and what is President Rodrigo Duterte's policy on the exercise? Before our discussion, take a look at this information.
Around 8,000 Philippine and U.S. troops kicked off annual military drills on Monday. That includes an exercise on a part of Luzon Island facing the disputed South China Sea.
Now, by the authority vested in me as the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, I hereby declare the Philippine-U.S. Exercise Balikatan 34-28 formally open.
The Balikatan exercises were first carried out in 1991, and the purpose is to maintain and develop the security relationship between the two countries' armed forces. Japan and Australia were also invited to join this year's military drills.
This year's Balikatan will not only focus on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, which are of course very important here in the Philippines, but also will incorporate training identified in the post-Marawi action reports, such as military operations in urban terrain.
Philippine officials were quick to point out they are not aimed at China, but at the threat of urban terrorism and other man-made crises and natural disasters. Former Philippine President Benigno Aquino III has taken a more adversarial policy on China, the only president who brought China to court over a dispute involving the South China Sea. China-Philippine relations have improved since current President Rodrigo Duterte was elected in 2016. Last year, Balikatan and several other annual joint military exercises between Philippine and U.S. forces had almost been called off, after Mr. Duterte said he would not want to offend China by holding the exercises. These will be the largest joint drills since Duterte took office. The Philippines is an important U.S. ally in the Pacific.
Well, if you are looking at our program today, we are talking about, in our second topic, about the drills between the United States and also the Philippines. We are joined in our studio by Mr. Zhang Junshe, Vice President of the China Naval Research Institute. Sir, welcome to our program. In Manila, we have Lucio Blanco Pitlo III, who is a lecturer at the Chinese Studies program of the Antonio de Manila University. And in Washington, D.C., U.S., we once again have Richard White, who's a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. I want to welcome to the three of you. Beginning from you, Mr. White, are we looking at a procedural joint military exercises between the two countries, or this is something much more significant than earlier times, particularly under the current president of the Philippines?
I think you phrased the question well. What we're seeing is, even under the new president, a continuation of long-standing Philippine-U.S. defense ties, including arms sales, visits by major warships, and these exercises. It's true that the last couple years there was a lot of rhetoric saying that these exercises might end, and they were scaled back somewhat. This time, they're larger than they were last year, but not as large as they might have been in some earlier iterations. What's new, perhaps, is there's a greater multilateralization. The Australians, the British, and others are participating as well. And you can read that two ways. It makes them somewhat more important, but it also can be seen as sort of diluting the U.S.-Philippine direct connection by embedding this in a kind of multilateral framework.
I see.
So in a way, it satisfies both parties.
I see. Take a look at this, what you have just mentioned, the scale of the drills. Based on the report we have, the annual Balikatan military exercise has a bigger U.S. contingent from 2,400 in the year 2017 to 3,000 this year. 5,000 Filipino soldiers will join them. Australia and Japan were invited to take part, but they are only sending 60 and 20 military observers respectively. That's what we are talking about for this year. So let me go to you, Mr. Pitlo III from the Philippines. More significant than previous years, or almost the same?
Well, I think the exercises this year jives with the President's independent foreign policy, friends to all and enemies to none. And at the same time, the alliance was able to demonstrate that it can respond to changing demands, and that wherever Philippine national interests has confluence with or convergence with allies like the U.S., in this case on the issue of counterterrorism, I think the alliance shows its vitality and its ability to adapt.
It is alliance, and it is allies alone, right? Mr. Zhang, how is China looking at this joint military exercise? We always remember South China Sea could be a very sensitive and also fundamental issue for China.
Well, actually, we can see some slight difference in the interpretations of the joint military exercise from the U.S. side and the Philippines side. On one hand, I think the Western media and the Western analysts are actually hyping up the importance of the exercise. They are emphasizing the importance and the solidarity between the United States and the Philippines. Actually, it's not true. And we can see from the Philippines officials what they have been saying. They said that this year's annual exercise will be focused on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and anti-terrorism. We can see also they have scrapped some items that were included in previous exercises, including the taking back of the islands that were presumably seized by other countries, probably China.
But and this is not in the itinerary anymore?
We don't see the items in this year.
I see. But on the other hand, Mr. Zhang, if I could just follow up by asking you, we understand the U.S. President Donald Trump is looking at his best way of thinking, which is making deals. So when it comes to deals, there's always an exchange. You give and you take. So people worry whether all kinds of issues are being put on the table by his strategy, including about the issue of South China Sea. For example, when he's dealing with China on the other issues, trade or DPRK. So, Mr. Zhang, from China's perspective, what do you make of the latest development in the South China Sea regarding the United States and China? Mr. Zhang.
Well, I think just as previous administrations, the current administration of the United States is also trying to use the South China Sea dispute as a tool to contain China. And they want to use the Philippines as a chessman in their strategy containing China. But we can see some difference in the Philippines' foreign policy. Mr. Duterte, since he took office in 2016, he has taken a more independent foreign policy toward China and also toward the United States.
I see.
It doesn't want to become a chessman in the games of the Americans containing China. So we have seen that the Philippines government has publicly said that the Philippines will not follow the United States in the so-called joint patrol in the South China Sea.
Mr. Bigelow III, can Philippines have a final say about what is the nature of this joint military exercise and also what is eventually going to turn out to be the content of this joint military exercise and possibly even its impact?
Yeah, I think the Philippine government under the Duterte administration has a very strong say in the nature and the tempo of the exercises for this year as well as of the last year. So we would see that compared to previous years where there's a lot of emphasis on maritime security and external defense, last year and this year was more on non-traditional security threats like disaster response, humanitarian assistance, and then this year the emphasis on counterterrorism, which is very relevant considering that it's just several months ago when the Philippines was able to recapture the city of Marawi from the clutches of militants. So I do think that the content and the nature of the exercises of this 34th iteration of the US-Philippines Balikatan exercises will be to a large extent determined by Philippine national interests and the convergence with the interests of allied countries like US, Australia in terms of dismantling the international network of terrorism.
I see. Mr. Weiss, though, let me put the question to you as well. I mean, when you see, for example, the rise of China in the Asia-Pacific region, when you see China and the United States in negotiation with one another about the nature of its relations, how do you see U.S. relations with its allies, including the Philippines, evolving in recent years, particularly now? Will that have an impact about the U.S. military so-called future interaction with the Philippines? Mr. White.
Clearly, under the current Philippine president, there's been an effort to, at least at the rhetorical level, move away from the U.S., move closer to China and Russia. And that has had some impact, but the exercises we're seeing now show that the U.S.-Philippine security ties still remain pretty strong. Overall, I don't think it's going to have much of an impact because the Philippines is not that important for the U.S. anymore. I mean, I think the major partners the U.S. has in Asia are Japan, South Korea, Australia, and then developing ties with Vietnam, some ties with Singapore, and so on, and that includes ties with the Philippines. But I just think they're a second order of magnitude. And I think that the Philippines could fully ally with China or Russia, and it still wouldn't make much of an impact on regional politics.
We have
from the defense perspective.
I see. We have less than a minute to go, so let me ask you once again, Mr. Pitlow, about that. How is Philippines designing its future with U.S. in the region and also certainly with China?
Well, I do think that the present government has a very clear stance in defining its relations with China independent of that of the U.S. And the same goes with its relations with the U.S. So it's trying to carve its own autonomous space within this great power contest, which is not an easy thing to do, but something that the government has to really be good at. So I think the Duterte administration is treading this path of making sure that this kind of exercises will not be in any way seen by China as directed against her, considering the improving relations. And that the issue with the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, there's already an ongoing mechanism to handle that. So I think the Duterte administration prefers that kind of approach, the bilateral consultation mechanism. So I think that track will continue.
Okay, we are running out of time for now, but I want to express my appreciation for the three of you gentlemen for being with us. Lucio Blanco Pitlow III coming from the Philippines, Mr. Zhang Junshe from China, and Mr. Richard White coming from the U.S. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. And with that, we're coming to the end of today's program. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.